In the bleak winter of 1891, nestled in the fog-laced hills of rural Pennsylvania, a set of twins was born under circumstances so obscure that local folklore still struggles to separate fact from fiction. The parents, Thomas and Eleanor Witmore, were quiet recluses, said to have moved to the outskirts of Wilkins Township just a year prior, after leaving behind their life in Baltimore for reasons never disclosed. Their farmhouse was perched at the edge of a forest known locally as the Hollow, an area steeped in superstition and long avoided by nearby townsfolk. When the twins arrived in January, amid biting winds and an unusually harsh snowfall, no midwife was called, no doctor summoned. For nearly 2 weeks, not a single soul outside that farmhouse even knew children had been born. It was only after a passing traveler spotted Eleanor trudging into town alone, pale and shivering, that the whispers began. She bought a strange mix of items from the general store: goat's milk, salt, black cloth, and a small silver mirror. When asked about the birth, she simply nodded and said, "They're here now. They don't cry." The statement alone was enough to set off speculation. Babies who didn't cry? In the 1890s, such silence was often considered a sign of illness, possession, or worse. A local midwife, Ruth Pringle, took it upon herself to visit the Witmore home uninvited. What she found only added to the growing mystery. Ruth would later recount her visit to a physician in Pittsburgh who documented the experience in a personal journal that was unearthed decades later. According to her account, the twins, girls no more than a few weeks old, lay side by side in a darkened nursery. They were healthy in appearance, with vivid blue eyes and jet-black hair, wrapped in swaddling cloth that bore faint symbols stitched in dark red thread. But what chilled Ruth was not their appearance, it was their demeanor. They made no sound, not even the restless cooing typical of newborns. Their eyes remained locked onto each other, unblinking, even as Ruth moved between them. It was as though they were aware of something, she wrote. Something I wasn't meant to see. Attempts to examine the children were gently refused by Eleanor, who insisted that they were in communion and must not be disturbed. Thomas, ever silent, simply stood near the doorway, watching. Ruth left uneasy and never returned, although her story became the first recorded observation of what would later be known as the silent twins phenomenon. As months passed, rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed the family had fled the East Coast to escape charges of spiritual fraud. Allegedly, Eleanor had once worked as a medium in a controversial seance circuit. Others believed the twins were cursed, born under a blood moon, and destined for something other than life in a quiet farmhouse. The truth, as it often is in such cases, remained frustratingly elusive. The local community, already wary of outsiders, kept their distance. The Witmores rarely came to town. When they did, they came together, moved quickly, spoke little. By the time the twins were toddlers, those few who had glimpsed them described an eerie coordination between the two, turning their heads in sync, reaching for objects in the same instant, responding not to speech, but to each other's glance. Not a word passed their lips. No crying, no babbling. Silence. Physicians invited to examine them declined, fearing the family's reputation and the growing unease surrounding their homestead. A local priest attempted to visit, offering a blessing, but was turned away at the gate. When he returned days later, he found a crudely carved cross nailed upside down to a tree on the property. He never went back. By 1895, the twins were 4 years old and still had never uttered a sound to anyone but each other. Yet they remained physically healthy, intellectually curious, and emotionally distant from all outside contact. It was at this point that the first serious investigation was initiated, not by local authorities, but by a traveling psychiatrist named Dr. Edwin Lang, who had heard of the case while attending a medical lecture in Philadelphia. His interest, however, would prove to be more than clinical. The mystery surrounding the Witmore twins had only begun to unfold. As the Witmore twins grew older, their silence became more than a curious trait. It turned into an enigma that baffled every observer who dared to look closely. By the time they were 6, it was clear that this was not a matter of delayed speech or a simple shyness. They had developed no spoken language recognizable to the world outside their farmhouse. Instead, they communicated through a series of gestures, fleeting glances, and what some described as a strange, melodic humming, always in unison, always together. It wasn't just communication, it was coordination. Where one moved, the other followed. Where one laughed, the other smiled. They existed, in the eyes of many, not as two individuals, but as one mind split between two bodies. A handful of outsiders who managed to observe them firsthand, including a schoolteacher named Margaret Finch, began keeping informal notes. Margaret had volunteered to tutor the girls in basic reading and arithmetic after seeing their mother struggle to keep up with their education. But her attempts at teaching were thwarted not by defiance or disinterest. Rather, the girls would only engage if they were seated beside one another, and even then they refused to speak aloud. Margaret described them as eager but unreachable, noting that they would respond to written words with identical facial expressions, sometimes even tracing the letters together without a word exchanged. It was as though they were reading each other's minds, not the books, she wrote. Most unsettling to her was the language they shared between themselves. It was not gibberish. It had grammar, rhythm, and repetition. Margaret tried to write some of it down, but nothing matched known dialects or indigenous tongues. Phonetic patterns emerged, but without any translation. Eventually, a linguistics professor from Allegheny College, Dr. Charles Redwin, was brought in at Margaret's urging. He managed to record the twins during a brief visit and later concluded that the girls had invented a private idioglossia, a self-constructed language that had no external referent. While such phenomena were extremely rare, what made this case unique was the age and fluency at which it had developed, and the twins' complete refusal to engage with standard English or any known language, even after years of exposure. Worry turned into fear when the humming began to change. It became more intense during storms or full moons, and their mother claimed it once went on uninterrupted for over 8 hours during a thunderstorm in July of 1899. Visitors began to report headaches and nausea when spending extended time around the girls. One carpenter, hired to repair a broken floorboard in their nursery, abandoned the job mid-task, claiming the girls stared through him while whispering something he couldn't understand. The local community, already suspicious, began to openly refer to them as the Hollow's ghosts. But it wasn't only the eerie language and silence that unsettled those who encountered the Witmore twins. It was their complete detachment from the world around them. They showed no affection to their parents, no curiosity toward other children, and no reaction to loud noises or physical stimuli unless it came from each other. Their expressions would change only in sync, their heads tilting at the exact same angle, their eyes following movements like trained dancers executing a practiced routine. On more than one occasion, their mother reported them waking up from sleep at the same time without any external disturbance, speaking their strange language as though continuing a conversation that had never paused. A physician who attempted to examine them in 1900 made note of their vital signs, which were inexplicably identical. Heart rates, body temperature, blood pressure, almost to the decimal. He wrote, "It is as if Their biology obeys not individuality, but duality. Not two entities, one divided life. When he attempted to speak to them separately, they refused to respond, becoming visibly agitated if kept apart for more than a few minutes. It was this exact behavior that led authorities to eventually recommend their separation for psychological study, an event that would, in time, prove far more disastrous than anyone anticipated. For now, though, the twins remained in their isolated world of unspoken words and silent understanding, defying everything Victorian medicine believed about childhood development, social behavior, and the boundaries of the human mind. By the turn of the century, the Witmore twins had become the subject of whispered fascination well beyond Wilkins Township. Though few had ever seen them in person, their reputation had grown to something far larger than their small world could contain. But among the most disturbing elements of their case, beyond their refusal to speak to anyone outside of each other, was their uncanny synchronicity. It was not simply that they acted alike or mirrored each other's mannerism. It was that their bodies, emotions, and even their physical responses seemed tethered to one another in ways no known science could explain. In early spring of 1901, a distant cousin from Baltimore, Lydia Grant, came to stay with the Witmore family after hearing about Eleanor's declining health. A pragmatic woman with no interest in superstition, Lydia was determined to understand what she considered a family embarrassment. But after just 2 weeks in the house, she left abruptly, telling neighbors she would never step foot in that place again, not even in death. In a letter that surfaced years later among her belongings, Lydia wrote, "They breathe together. They blink together. One coughs and the other flinches. I watched them eat, and it was as if they had rehearsed every bite, and yet no one is teaching them to do this. No one can." Lydia also recounted an incident during a mild kitchen accident. Eleanor had burned her hand on a kettle, and as she screamed, one of the twins began to sob uncontrollably, while the other remained calm but wide-eyed. The sobbing girl's tears stopped instantly the moment Eleanor was tended to. No one had spoken a word. There was no signal exchanged, only reaction. And it wasn't isolated. More and more people, neighbors, distant relatives, even a newspaper man who briefly visited for a feature, began to report the same thing. The twins responded not to external events, but to internal echoes between each other. The strangest accounts came from the family physician, Dr. Isaac Grover, who began keeping a journal exclusively for the twins' visits. He once tested their sensory reactions by placing a pin on the palm of one twin while observing the other. The twin who wasn't touched recoiled slightly before her sister even flinched. He repeated the test in different rooms at different times. The results were always the same. Their reactions occurred nearly simultaneously, regardless of location. In his journal, Grover wrote, "This goes beyond mimicry or coincidence. We may be observing a form of linked consciousness." What truly began to disturb those around them, however, was not simply how identical their behaviors had become, but how inversely tied their moods were. If one twin grew animated or happy, the other became lethargic and withdrawn. It was as if there were a finite amount of emotional energy between them, and when one drew from it, the other was left depleted. On one occasion, during a particularly lively lesson with Margaret Finch, the more engaged twin, Margaret could never quite tell them apart, laughed, clapped, and even attempted to write a full sentence on her slate. Meanwhile, her sister sat motionless, her eyes vacant and unfocused. The moment the first twin paused, the second seemed to come back to life. Finch wrote in a letter, "It was like they couldn't both be present at once. Like one consciousness had to sleep while the other woke." Soon even the family began to notice physical consequences. If one twin developed a cold, the other exhibited symptoms within hours. Bruises appeared on both girls even when only one had suffered an injury. On a grim Sunday in late autumn, one of the twins fell down the stairs and fractured her wrist. Before Eleanor could even reach her, the other girl, still at the top of the stairs, screamed and clutched her own arm in agony. She was unhurt, but her wrists swelled and darkened just the same. X-rays revealed no break, yet she wore a sling for weeks, mimicking the recovery of her sister with uncanny precision. Word spread, and with it came a tension that the Witmores had long feared. Scientists, theologians, even spiritualists expressed interest. Some called it an extreme case of twin telepathy. Others whispered darker theories, shared souls, mirror curses, or incomplete reincarnations. The truth, though, remained elusive. What they were witnessing was not simply an emotional bond or a family oddity. It was a breakdown in the known rules of biology and identity, something terrifying because it couldn't be explained, only observed. And it was only a matter of time before someone decided the bond needed to be broken. By the winter of 1902, the Witmore twins had reached 11 years of age, and their condition, if one dared to still call it that, had not changed. They remained locked in their own language, speaking only to each other in soft, rhythmic utterances that no one could decipher. They continued to move and react in unnerving unison. They would still not acknowledge others unless prompted simultaneously. Their lives unfolded with a kind of spectral symmetry, so absolute that even seasoned professionals began to feel unnerved in their presence. It was during this period that the state of Pennsylvania, responding to pressure from both medical authorities and a growing public curiosity, intervened. Dr. Edwin Lang, the traveling psychiatrist, who had first taken interest in the twins 2 years prior, submitted a formal proposal to the State Board of Public Health. In it, he argued that the girls' psychological development was dangerously stunted and that their emotional codependence risked rendering them incapable of functioning in society. His solution, controversial but persuasive in certain circles, was simple. They needed to be separated, not temporarily, not as a brief observational experiment, but permanently, as a way to force the twins to develop distinct personalities, language skills, and independent thought. The idea appalled the Witmore parents, but they were given little choice. In March of 1902, the state ordered the girls to be placed in separate mental institutions for observation, rehabilitation, and moral instruction. The separation was abrupt and clinical. The girls were taken from their home under the pretense of a routine medical evaluation. They were placed in carriages, driven in opposite directions, and admitted the same night, one to the new Bloomfield State Hospital, the other to a rural facility outside Harrisburg. Nurses present during the initial intake noted something disturbing. Neither twin resisted, cried, or protested. Instead, both became completely silent, eyes wide, posture rigid. It was as if, in being separated, a vital thread had been cut, not just between the girls, but within them. The effects were almost immediate. Within the first 48 hours, both girls exhibited signs of acute psychological distress. One refused to eat. The other began to sleep for almost 18 hours a day. Their strange language, so consistent and constant throughout their lives, ceased entirely. Neither attempted English or responded to speech from staff. They became listless and emotionally flat, as if stripped of something integral. Doctors were initially optimistic, believing it was a sign of psychological withdrawal that would eventually give way to normal development. But as weeks passed, the situation deteriorated. At New Bloomfield, the twin assigned there began exhibiting dissociative episodes. She would stand in corners for hours, muttering phrases that made no sense to anyone. She refused to write, speak, or even move during group sessions. Nurses report hearing her whisper at night, apparently to someone not in the room. Meanwhile, the other twin at the Harrisburg facility began drawing endless spirals and twin figures in the margins of her notebooks. Always two figures, one dark, one pale. She began scratching her own skin in straight, mirrored lines across both arms. When restrained, she went utterly still and stared at her reflection in a mirror for hours. What most unsettled the medical staff was the mirrored timing of their symptoms. When one developed insomnia, the others stopped waking up entirely. When one had a nosebleed, unexplained and spontaneous, the other began vomiting for no medical reason. The facilities, though nearly 100 miles apart, reported these episodes within hours of each other. Eventually, doctors began corresponding directly, tracking events like investigators trying to map out the logic of a haunting. But the patterns were undeniable. The girls were suffering in tandem, even apart. Not psychologically, not metaphorically, physically. In August of that year, during a heat wave, one of the twins was found collapsed in her room, unconscious but alive. Her pulse was weak and irregular. She was rushed to the infirmary. At nearly the same moment, a nurse at the second institution found the other twin sitting up in bed, smiling softly for the first time in months. She seemed relieved, the nurse would later report, as if something had been lifted. By morning, the unconscious twin died. The autopsy listed heart failure, though there were no defects in the tissue. No disease, no damage, just failure. A body that had simply given up. When the news reached the surviving twin, she responded with something no one expected. Fluent, clear English. She looked at her nurse and said, "It had to be one of us." The death of one of the Witmore twins in the late summer of 1902 should have marked the quiet conclusion of a disturbing but ultimately explainable medical mystery. Instead, it opened a door into something stranger, something far more unsettling than anyone had been prepared to confront. The official records from the Harrisburg facility noted the time of death at 3:47 a.m. The cause listed as idiopathic cardiac failure. Essentially, the heart had stopped for no discernible reason. The girl had been physically healthy, monitored closely, and showed no signs of distress in the hours leading up to it. But those who had watched her in her final weeks said something different. They said she had grown quieter, not just mute, but spiritually empty. They described her as drifting away, her body still present but her gaze distant, as though she were already beginning to disappear long before her heart followed. What shocked everyone even more was the immediate change in the surviving twin. Within hours of her sister's death, before the news had officially reached her, she began to speak. At first her voice was quiet and measured but fully articulate. Gone was the private language, the humming rhythms, the echo chamber speech she had shared with her sister since infancy. Instead, she spoke in perfect English. Her vocabulary was advanced for her age. She asked for a book, requested a specific type of tea, and referred to her nurse by name. It was as though someone had flipped a switch in her brain, unlocking a version of her that had been waiting silently behind the eyes all along. Doctors were astonished. In a matter of days, the girl who had never acknowledged the world beyond her twin was suddenly calm, coherent, and startlingly aware of everything that had occurred. She recounted events from early childhood with perfect clarity, events no one had believed she could remember. She named people from the town, described rooms from her family home, even recounted in vivid detail her removal from the farmhouse and the carriage ride to the institution. Her recollections were so lucid, so confident, that the staff at the hospital began to question whether she had been truly mute all along, or whether she had simply chosen silence. But when asked about her twin, about what had happened, her answers turned cryptic. She knew it was going to be her, the girl said once, during a session with Dr. Lang, who had traveled to interview her in person. We decided. Not in words. It wasn't like that. But we knew. When Lang pressed her further, she became quiet and smiled slightly. It was heavy, she said. There wasn't room for both of us. We couldn't stay like that. It wasn't natural. Her statements defied psychological convention. There was no clear diagnosis to explain her speech recovery, her emotional composure, or her strange certainty about her sister's death. She did not cry. She did not mourn in the way children were expected to. She would later say in a soft voice, "She's not gone. Not really. But I can move now. I can breathe." It was as if, in the moment her twin had passed, she had absorbed something, a space, a voice, or perhaps even a consciousness. Medical records noted her rapid development in the following months. She advanced through her lessons at a startling pace. She socialized, albeit cautiously, and even developed a fascination with art and geometry, particularly symmetry. She began drawing again, though unlike her previous mirrored figures, her new sketches depicted solitary girls walking into fog, always leaving behind a shadow that did not follow. Some of the nurses began whispering among themselves. They said she had a way of finishing people's sentences before they spoke them, that she would sit silently in the gardens and turn her head before someone entered the path behind her. One even claimed that she asked about a doctor's dying mother before anyone had told the girl the woman was ill. The surviving twin's name, something almost no one outside the family ever knew, was Lillian. She would go on to live until 1932 quietly, without scandal. She never married, never left Pennsylvania, and never again spoke publicly of her sister. But in her private diaries discovered after her death, one sentence appears over and over, written in different handwritings, at different angles, sometimes reversed, like a mirror script. We shared everything. In the years following the death of one Witmore twin and the sudden awakening of the other, public and academic interest in the case peaked, and then, strangely, began to recede. What had been front-page fodder in medical journals and whispered legend in rural Pennsylvania slowly faded into obscurity. Perhaps it was the discomfort of not having clear answers. Perhaps the silence that followed the event felt too final, too absolute, to question further. But those closest to the case, the doctors, nurses, and family, knew that the story had not ended. It had merely withdrawn from the public eye, much like the surviving twin herself. For a time, Lillian, now speaking fluently, behaving independently and seemingly flourishing, was considered a kind of medical miracle. Doctors marveled at her adaptation and speculated endlessly about the mechanics of her transformation. Some believed she had simply outgrown her mutism, forced into individuation by extreme trauma. Others proposed more radical theories, that she had adopted her sister's identity as a way to cope, or even that she had always been the dominant consciousness, and her twin had merely functioned as a psychic mirror, now no longer necessary. But there were details that refused to be rationalized. One of the most glaring mysteries was the disappearance of the girl's early psychiatric records. When Dr. Lang returned to study the case more deeply in 1905, he found that several documents had gone missing from both the Bloomfield and Harrisburg facilities. Intake notes, language recordings, behavioral logs, even correspondences between staff, all vanished. Hospital administrators denied any wrongdoing. Some blamed a clerical error. Others pointed to a minor basement fire in 1903 that had reportedly damaged certain archives. But curiously, only the files related to the Witmore twins were gone. Other patient records from the same years remained intact and accessible. Lang, suspicious of this convenient gap in documentation, reached out to the Witmore family, hoping to retrieve any personal notes or journals Eleanor or Thomas might have kept. But by then Eleanor had passed away, reportedly from pneumonia, and Thomas had moved out of state, whereabouts unknown. Neighbors claimed he left one morning without a word, abandoning the farmhouse entirely. The property sat vacant for years and was eventually razed in 1912 after falling into ruin. A few local boys who explored the home before its demolition claimed to find pages of scribbled writing in the nursery. Strange symbols, mirror letters, numbers scratched into the floorboards beneath the old bed frame. But those pages were never recovered, and no official record of them exists. Even Lillian's diaries, found decades later in a chest in her modest home, offer more questions than answers. While most entries are coherent and neatly written, there are pages where the writing shifts, sometimes abruptly mid-sentence, into the same odd symbols used by the twins in childhood. In some places, her script spirals inward toward the center of the page. In others, it appears mirrored, readable only when reflected. There are entire entries where she speaks as we rather than I, and always with a calm tone, never distressed. She writes not of missing her sister, but of being her, of continuing for both, as if the split between them had been artificial all along, and only one consciousness had truly remained. The psychiatric community eventually distanced itself from the case. Theories began to shift with time. In the 1920s, as Freudian analysis took hold, many retroactively diagnosed the twins with early childhood trauma, likely stemming from parental neglect or hidden abuse. Others attributed their behavior to a combination of cryptophasia and selective mutism, rare but not unexplainable. The more outlandish theories about dual consciousness, psychic entanglement, or spiritual possession were pushed to the margins of academic thought, relegated to obscure journals or privately circulated letters. Still, a few medical historians clung to the story. Dr. Lang, until his death, maintained that the Witmore twins represented something beyond traditional science. In one of his last lectures, he referred to them not as a case study, but as a phenomenon. We observed in them a form of emotional physics, he said, where identity, memory, and biology may have been entangled like particles, two minds behaving as one until the universe forced a decision. That language, forced a decision, echoes eerily when viewed alongside one of the final entries in Lillian's diary, dated 1929, just 3 years before her death. The page contains only a single line, written in the same childlike scrawl seen in earlier mirrored notes. They let me go because I remembered to forget. If stories like this leave a chill in your spine and a question in your mind, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to Bloodlore for more unsettling histories, unsolved medical anomalies, and true accounts that blur the line between reality and something far stranger.